Okay. Good evening. Hey, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Cheers to you. Uh, so, on this 20th episode, we're talking wine hangovers and some of the misconceptions and some of the um, thoughts about wine hangovers. So, I follow a bunch of wine um, Instagram channels that are about very meme culture, but focused in wine because it's comical how you can tie like popular culture or um, cartoons and then put some context about wine in there, and it makes it hysterical. So I saw a funny one today. It was a SNL, a Saturday Night Live skit that the meme is fairly regular, but in the meme, it's the main presenter guy, and it just says alcohol, and then behind it is the alcohol character shooting a guy who's physically being shot and like laying on the ground, and it just says massive hangover under him, and then on the sub picture below it, it's the same guy looking at the camera saying, "Why would sulfides do this?" Um, and it just got me thinking about everything that everyone will blame on a hangover, um, whether it be the tannins in red wine or red wine versus a white wine. I can only drink Chardonnay because it doesn't give me a hangover as much as Pinot Noir or Cabernet, whatever they're saying. Um, or people will blame tannins. All these tannic wines, I can't drink them because they're too. They'll give me too much of a hangover. Um, and then it just goes to show that people just don't understand really what they're consuming and what the difference is between um, red wines and white wines, and the process of making them, and really how, you know, even people will blame sulfides or the addition of sulfur dioxide to preserve the wine, and say, oh, I only drink organic wines because they're naturally lower in sulfur, and always makes me giggle because they just don't know. There's people out there with sulfur allergies, um, which is also awkward. Um, I doubt that there's very many people with actually diagnosed sulfur allergies because you need sulfur to live. It's one of the largest metabolites between sulfur, calcium, potassium. They're some of the largest compounds that you need for biochemical regulation within the body. But I digress. Um, and so it got me laughing and thinking about really the context behind the thoughts of sulfur in or sulfides in wine, and what that actually is and means, and how much there actually is in realistic worlds of wine, whether it's organic wine to normal commercial wine to higher end luxury wine. Um, and you can even talk about clean wine or um, the the other end of the spectrum of high sugar, highly processed wines, and what that limit really is, and then even contrast it to other fruits, vegetables that also can contain, and frozen foods is another aspect. Um, but I would really highly suggest there's two amazing Instagram accounts that have some funny um, wine memes. Basically, it's one's called Shitty Wine Memes, and then the other one is Subculture Sommelier. And I get a kick out of it every day. Popping Instagram open, just laughing about that. I thought I had a water somewhere. It's gone. Oh well. So so sulfides in wine. What? Well, let's talk about why sulfur's added to wine. Sulfur's been added to wines probably since they could deduce that it had a positive effect in fairly low concentrations. And with that, um, the the form of it has changed from actual straight sulfur into mechanically made sulfur dioxide, or now sulfur salts, which we use regularly. Throughout the process, even high-end luxury producers will still add sulfur to a fermenter to um, kind of knock down any bad populations of bacteria that are very susceptible to it that could cause issue in a very high-end wine, and in relatively low amounts. I mean, you can see up to 40, 50 parts per million of addition being made up front, fairly ubiquitously across of all wine production. I would even say in organic wines, you'd see that. You'd see that first initial hit of sulfur, even in organic wines, because they can add sulfur in organic wines. They just have to keep a limit on how much they actually totally add. And so, sulfur has kind of two aspects: the antimicrobial aspect, as well as it's this oxygen scavenger. It will bind and reduce the amount of oxygen in terms of dissolved oxygen, as well as overall. In its gaseous form, it's really great at covering the headspace of a tank of wine to prevent microbial growth on top, as well as keeping a layer of a blanket, essentially, across the top of a tank, preventing oxygen from coming in contact with it. And think of it like you would just lay a gas in it, because it's heavier than atmospheric air, which is mostly nitrogen. It will be heavier and land on top of that wine, create a barrier. Other people, you can use other gases that are heavier than atmospheric air. You can use argon. You can use CO2. You can use straight nitrogen. Not as effective. It's about the same weight as standard air, which is mostly nitrogen anyway, with that little bit of oxygen and other stuff in there. So there's the two effects, and then people also use it in barrels to maintain a barrel while it's empty. You clean that barrel when you're done using it, and then you actually either burn a sulfur disc to release that into the barrel to protect the wine from any other microbial growth that happen while it's empty. I personally prefer a sulfur gas. A little bit easier to use. It's more potent, so you have to use respirators to protect yourself applying that. And it's another thing too about sulfur use in winemaking is it is an allergen. If you ever smell sulfur dioxide being applied, it's potentially deadly in concentration. Not in what we're adding in the wine, but from the raw material that you're using, it can be very obnoxious to your respiratory system, as well as it can hurt your eyes, your nose, and all that. You can make it very difficult to breathe, and you taste that sulfur for hours on end if you get a big enough blast. So that's the uses and the kind of a little bit of the history of it. And from there, Live Laugh Lloyd, what's up, man? Speaking of noxious, what about ethanol turning acetaldehyde, using ALDH to make acetate, which disrupts dendrites, and positive ion flows path through to the lipid bilayer, causing headaches. Wow, that is sort of obnoxious. There's, I can imagine that metabolic pathway is correct, but I would have to look into that because, that looks right. But all those metabolic pathways of what causes a hangover have a multitude effect on all your internal body systems, through dehydration, through is I dumb? Alcohol and hangovers. Yeah. Oh, I'll have to look up that paper. I'm gonna search it right now while I'm sitting here. But back on the topic of, I can't copy out of here. Oh well, that's not hard. Why is alcohol and hangovers? It was for college. Gotta love that. Why are my hangovers getting? Oh my gosh! Just type in hangovers in Google and holy moly! The best is the first thing that pops up is the science behind explosive hangover poops. So first thing it has to be about feces. Lovely. Thank you for that. So I'll show you guys the meme that I was talking about that made me laugh because it is just funny. So alcohol, shooting hangover. Like, why did SoFi do this? Lovely. Um, the so and then moving throughout the wine process, we add sulfur. Basically, up front when you crush, we add sulfur. On the back end of when a wine is finished fermenting on whites, rosés, or even reds that you may not go through any sort of like secondary malic acid conversion or fermentation. And then on the red wines, post that malactic fermentation, MLF, we'll add sulfur there. And then we maintain a sulfur level using sulfur dioxide or potassium metasulfite as that sulfur salt. And, you know, relatively speaking, in terms of total sulfur in, I shouldn't shake the table because it shakes my camera. Speaking of total sulfur, just from being a commercial winemaker, making wines that we're not super concerned about the total sulfur in wine. Even on wines that are 2-3 years old, total sulfurs can get up to about 100, 120, maybe 150 total parts per million. Some of those numbers can be increased when you start talking about wines with very, very high residual sugar, where you're fighting to keep that wine stable, clean, long, and you know, you can see sometimes you can get up into maybe 250 total parts. There is a hard limit within the United States of 300 total parts per million, and essentially after that point, that wine is not usable for sale or to be sold in a bottle. You can blend that down with something else that has lower sulfur and test that product going from there. But essentially, those are wines that are just highly unstable. They're probably, again, something very sweet or have very defective in some sort of way. But in general terms, when we start testing wines, maybe that have been bottled for a while, we'll see total sulfur levels below 100, maybe 110, and it always shocks me knowing when we add and what we're adding, and you're seeing that total sulfur level be that low in a red wine, maybe not a big red wine, and even white wines, and even sweet wines that we bottle, they never get that high. One, we're trying to bottle them quickly so we kind of lock that wine in place and not have it sitting around fighting that wine in tank from doing something else. So that's excuse me, froggy in my throat. And so that's your basic thing. And then just to put in perspective, even on the high end limit, other packaged products of varying quality, can have just as high sulfur levels. Beans, sodas, packaged meats have sulfides. Um, Prepared canned food can actually, you can start seeing some jumps into the 4 or 500 realm of total sulfides added. Frozen juices, treated lettuce actually has an extreme amount of sulfides being added to knock off any spoilage items. They'll basically get a sulfur, um, SO2 and water combination little bath to treat those to preserve that. I think it's in certain types of lettuce that'll be treated. Other higher end products probably don't use that methodology, or they have cleaner setups, but they exist when you talk about that. And then, interestingly enough, a lot of um, frozen foods, when it comes to frozen, flash frozen vegetables, peas, hardier items, can contain a fair amount of total sulfur for a preservative. And then the biggest culprit of them all, again, is that dried fruit, raisins, whether it's peaches or nectarines or plums or raisins, all those dried fruits can see a very, even like dehydrated apple slices, um, all those items, they use sulfur on that upfront before they dry stuff to keep that product safe until it's dried, and then that total amount in there will preserve and maintain that through its shelf life. Prepackaged lemon juices and fruit juices and all that can see a heavy amount of sulfur in there. So it's, if you eat those things and I've had that. I've been at tastings where they're serving dried fruit and people just noshing on them, and then in the same regard complaining about how much total sulfur is in a wine, which is wild. They just don't realize. And then it goes into what is causing a hangover, and that's really my biggest point of what is really causing that hangover when you are drinking wine, and it always goes back to the basic of what you are consuming. You're consuming ethanol. That's alcohol. That, speaking of, I should ingest some. That amount of alcohol has those effects in your system. Your body having to get that out of your system, and the dehydration effect on your brain. That's the biggest key there. And one of the biggest tests I think I've ever personally done is looking at, sounds terrible, but if you have a bottle of a lower alcohol Sauvignon Blanc, and it's low alcohol, call it 12.5%. And actually tested at 12.5% ethanol, not what's labeled at, but that wine's at 12.5%, and then you have a 15.5% Pinot Noir. Say one night, and again in an experimental setting, you could eat the same amount of food, drink the same amount of water. You can have that one bottle of Sauvignon Blanc one night, and then maybe 2 nights later, try to eat the same food, same amount of water. Take that experiment, have a full bottle of called Pinot Noir at 15.5%. There's 3% more ethanol per volume in that. So, in that sense, that full liquid volume, you basically consumed that 12.5% on that Sauvignon Blanc night, and then on that Pinot Noir night, you had a 15.5%, 3%. So you're basically having that Sauvignon Blanc bottle plus a very light beer of low alcohol that say it has 3%. If you're having a whole bottle of wine and a beer, which one do you think is going to give you a bigger hangover? Regardless of your body weight and composition and drinking prowess, I'm gonna go with the second night. I've done this and felt that way. You have, especially in the last 15, 20 years, the alcohol levels on wines have only gone up. There's some research in low alcohol wines to curb that thought of hangovers and healthier lifestyle. Um, we're looking at that now, and 10 episodes back, we did Vino Verde, which are 9.5, 10% alcohol, and you can drink, a fair good amount of that and not feel the same intoxicating effects because you're getting a fairly low amount of um, ethanol by volume in that same 750 milliliters. Now there's even, there goes my keyboard. Now we're even looking at the wines with even lower alcohol through mechanical means of de-alking wines to get to 6, 7%, 8% wines that started out at that 13, 14, 15%, and bringing it down to a more reasonable level. You lose some of the aspects and flavor characteristics of that low alcohol wine, but it there's definitely a place for it, so that people maybe don't feel the effects so much and have a little bit more of a healthier for you lifestyle. And there can be some positive attributes of the total alcohol consumption. You're getting the positive benefits of drinking wine, but you're not getting as intense hangover effects, for lack of a better term. I personally, on the other hand, prefer full strength, balanced wines. That's how winemaking has been approached and been. Oh, plane just flew. It's flying really. Oh, helicopter's flying over my house. That is the interesting part from that is that that aspect of alcohol, and that's my spiel for the night. This one's gonna be short because I spent 10 minutes on mute. So the but hey, I thank everyone for joining this part. And we are, depending on, I got an update right now, and my computer's